Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 134, which is a relatively high number. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And last night I came home from work with kind of a scratchy throat, which when I woke up early this afternoon had metamorphosed, if you will, into a full-blown sore throat. And now I'm starting to get like a runny nose and it's like traveling down into my trachea or something. And it seems like I'm catching a cold. No worries though, it appears to be not life-threatening. And the show must go on. So we're doing this. I actually feel pretty good despite the nasal irritation and all that. And the throat irritation, I should say. So anyways, we don't have a whole heck of a lot of questions, which is good because it's going to give my throat kind of a rest to do one of these that's less than 3 hours long. So I got the beverage, which is here, paper umbrella, demonstrating my class and style and sophistication. And I just stabbed myself in the face accidentally with said paper umbrella. But before I start answering questions, I would like to give a shout out to somebody named Kevin who cashed out me a donation several days ago. And unlike PayPal, I haven't figured out how to message anyone acknowledging, the generosity of their donation and all that. So I'm doing it here because I don't know how to do it otherwise. Also, I would like to express a little bit of, skeptical cynicism perhaps, in that I mentioned in the previous Q&A that I do get like acid reflux. Somebody asked a question, I didn't just blurt it out, just unprompted. And so I get these comments saying, if you got acid reflux, what you need is to drink more acid, like vinegar or something. And it just doesn't make sense to me. This seems like some kind of a psyop. So anyone who suggested that I like consume more acid because of acid reflux, your name is on a list now. And it doesn't seem to be true. I mean, I haven't tried the apple cider vinegar, but orange juice is one of the things that I really cannot drink, within like 2 hours of going to bed, just because acid. Citric acid in this case, plus a little ascorbic acid, I suppose. Anyways, let's just start answering questions. And the first question is from Master Po. And Master Po says, what does Atthakavagga mean in English? And there are two Atthakavaggas in the Pali Tipitaka. One is the chapter of 8s in the Anguttara Nikaya, which goes, it's divided up into groups or chapters from 1 to 2 to 3 up to 11. So 8 is in between 1 and 11, and so there is an Atthakavagga of the Anguttara Nikaya. But the Atthakavagga that I usually mention is in the Sutta Nipata. And the meaning of that vaga means like group or chapter. But ataka, atta, is the Pali word for 8. So it's related to the English word 8, like octo, as in octopus from Greek. It's all based on Proto-Indo-European. The ka at the end, ataka, means like a group of 8 or an octad. So it is the chapter of octads. And the reason why the Atthakavagga is called the chapter of octads, even though there's 16 suttas in there, is because there's a core, like a nucleus of 4 suttas, each of which is 8 stanzas in length. And they are considered to be possibly the 4 oldest suttas in the Atthakavagga. So it's the chapter of octads, or the group of octads. So that was relatively easy. Let's move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, does karma negate the idea of free will? I don't think that karma would negate the idea of free will. What does negate the idea of free will is no self. Anatta in Pali, anatman in Sanskrit. Because free will implies that there is this entity that is separate from everything around it that is making its own choices independently to some degree of everything around it. And that would be a self. Buddhism teaches there is no self. So that pretty much kicks free will in the head when you don't have a self. Also, the Anatalakkhana Sutta, which is considered to be, by tradition, the Buddha's second discourse after his enlightenment, he points out that you cannot say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, to any of the 5 khandhas and have it reliably happen. And one of those 5 khandhas is Sankhara Khandha, which is volition, mainly volition. So even your own volitions, you do not have complete control over them. So that kind of negates the idea of free will also, at least to some degree. But what mainly kicks free will in the head for a Buddhist is the concept of no self. Because free will does imply that there has to be a self that has this free will. So, I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I've been practicing insight meditation consistently for a year or so. For approximately 20 minutes a day, I focus on the sensations of my breath, the speed and rhythm of the in-out and rise-fall, the temperature of the air, etc. When I get distracted by a thought, body sensation, sound, etc., I note what drew away my attention, then gently bring my focus back to my breath. Since I've been meditating, I can definitely say that I feel much calmer, more patient, and more centered in the present moment, but I am confused about which profound insights into myself or reality I am supposed to be gaining. Can you please speak on this? And I've got this divided up into 2 questions, which is erroneous. So I got to fix that. Okay, so you see, Romeo is confused about which profound insights into himself or reality he is supposed to be gaining. And I've considered this for many years to be a mistake to tell somebody in advance what kind of insight they're supposed to have, because it's sort of like implanting a suggestion, and then you get into some kind of hypnotic state, you see exactly what you're told to see. That this happens like in the Mahasi method, like when I spent some time at Pandita Rama in Rangoon, U Pandita would be telling people in advance what kind of insights they were supposed to be having. And some of the people would go into like these deep hypnotic states and just dutifully see what they were told. And in one case, there was a Korean Mahayana monk there who did not have a complete mastery of the English language. And so he misunderstood what he was supposed to be seeing. And then he saw through his own insight the mistaken version of what he was supposed to be experiencing. And then U Pandita just kind of angrily told him, no, you didn't experience that. And I've considered that it would be a good experiment to, like at a place like Pa Auk in southern Burma, that you take a group of people that don't know hardly anything about Theravada Buddhism, like Taiwanese nuns or something, and you just teach them everything wrong. You teach them Abhidharma stuff wrong. It's like 13 mind moments to every moment of matter and all this stuff. You just teach it to them wrong. And then when they start having their insights into the nature of reality through the samadhi eye, is it going to come out right? Or is it going to come out the way they were told it was going to come out? So, profound insights into yourself or reality, you're probably better off not being told in advance what kind of insights you're supposed to have, because then your subconscious mind can conjure up fake insights, and you can wind up fooling yourself with that. Also, the official list in Burmese, it's called Nyanzin. It's the Vipassana insight knowledges that you're supposed to experience in the correct order, in sequential order. And when you get to the final one, then you've become an Arya. And one of them is Namarupa Paricheda Jnana, something like that. No, it's not Paricheda. Namarupa something Jnana. It's like the insight knowledge of distinguishing mind from matter. And I'm pretty sure when I was at Panditarama, I actually experienced that one. It's one of the earlier ones. And to me, it wasn't really an insight distinguishing mind from matter. It was more of an insight distinguishing like sensation from perception, or like feeling from perception. You know, it's like you have this almost pristine sensory data, and then your mind just starts interpreting it. So it was like a clear distinction. Like it was really kind of striking, the distinction between sort of the incoming data with maybe some unavoidable preliminary, you know, just automatic perception involved in that. And then there's like the thinking mind just takes that ball and runs with it and just starts like this commentary on it. And it was very clear distinction. So I think that maybe whoever named it Namarupa Paricheda Jnana, or whatever jnana, I think even they didn't really understand what it was that they were describing, because matter is problematic. The mind cannot know physical matter. The mind can only know mind, because that's what it is. But I mean, you can have insights that aren't necessarily on any list. Like one of the most important insights I experienced as a meditator, as a monk, is once you get to the point where you stop thinking, then you realize that you are not your thoughts, because when your thinking stops, you don't stop. Or at least, you know, the conscious process doesn't stop. And if anything, you're more conscious after you stop thinking than when you're thinking. Because when you're thinking, your mind is narrowed down to focus on what it is that you are perceiving. And you're just kind of ignoring everything else. You're ignoring the entire rest of the sensorium. Whereas if your mind is just wide open, you're wide awake, you're not thinking anything, then, you know, it's like the entire sensorium is equally in focus. But again, you're probably better off not being told in advance what kind of profound insights you're going to have, because then your subconscious mind can just dutifully generate some facsimile or approximation of these insights, and then it's not a genuine insight. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, that was interesting about your termination potion. What was it made from? And this is like a follow-up question from an answer I gave to a question in the previous Q&A about somebody talking about how they were considering auto-termination, and asked if I had ever considered it. And then I said, for years as a monk, I did have like a certain substance on hand just in case, you know, I needed like an escape route, like a fire exit or something, which, as you may have guessed, I never used. But all it was just a big bag of charcoal. And when you're living in a cave with almost no air circulation, I assume that would be sufficient. And then Fred follows up with, I am probably the oldest viewer, but physically okay. I also had topping thoughts, which he's referring to auto-termination, I suppose. And then he said, I had hip replacement a while ago. It's general wear and tear. Well, good luck with your health, Fred. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from a clever fellow called Cherzaskazes, who keeps changing his name, and I can't pronounce his new name, so we're just going with Cherzaskazes, which I also don't know how to pronounce, but at least I've settled on one variant of pronunciation on that one. So Cherzaskazes, or whatever he's calling himself today, says, as a young monk, have you believed in most of the orthodox Theravada teachings, maybe without Abhidharma? And when I was a young monk, when I first was ordained, I hadn't read very much of the Pali Tipitaka. I was not extremely well acquainted with orthodox Theravada Buddhist doctrine. You know, I was almost totally innocent of the commentarial tradition, for example, knew almost nothing about Abhidharma. I just read some suttas. You know, read the Sutta Nipata, the Dhammapada, certain verses from or certain suttas from the Majjhima Nikaya, the Digha Nikaya, and this kind of stuff. But, I mean, I was pretty naive. And when I first became a monk, I had this idea that Theravada Buddhism, like the Theravada Buddhists were so conservative, they were afraid to change anything. And so with Theravada Buddhism, you still had the original Buddhism. And the more I read, the more I studied, the less likely that became. Like even in the suttas, there's certain suttas. I mean, the talking animals, the fire-breathing cobra dragons, the Buddha just bragging in grandiose terms about how great he is and how people should worship him. This kind of stuff, I just couldn't really, I just couldn't accept that. I just do not have like the dogmatic follower kind of mentality. It's like I still have like a critical mind, and maybe a little too critical sometimes, but you read like there's a sutta where there's a follower of the Jains who's a master of debate, and he's bragging in advance about how he's going to go to this philosopher Gautama and just wipe the floor with him in debate. He's just going to take him like an elephant takes like something in its trunk and just kind of beats around with it. He's just going to just mess him up. He's such a famous, renowned debater. He's so good at debate. He goes to the Buddha. The Buddha asks him a question couched in Buddhist terminology. This Jain debater just agrees with this assumption that a Jain wouldn't even agree with in reality, and he just surrenders. He quits the debate immediately. He just immediately converts to Buddhism after just like one utterance that was doctrinally wrong view from a Jain point of view. And so I'd read this kind of stuff. It's like, no, that wouldn't happen in real life. Or there's a sutta in the Sutta Nipata where there's some Brahmin who he wants to make an offering to some Brahmin holy man. He sees the Buddha sitting under a tree, and the Buddha apparently had like his head covered with his robe or something. Maybe it was a cold day. So he gets closer, and then he realizes that it's a Buddhist monk. It's a shramana with a shaven head or something like this. And he just starts calling him, you worthless skinhead. And then the Buddha says, like, do you know what is a skinhead, or what is conducive to being a skinhead? And then the Brahmin just immediately does a 180 and just, no, venerable sir, please explain to me what makes a skinhead. Oh, he calls him an outcast. It's the outcast sutta. I think it's the Vasala Sutta of the Sutta Nipata. And it's like, people just don't act this way. Maybe on TV, where they'll just do a complete 180 just for no apparent reason whatsoever. I mean, it reminds me of an old episode of the Flintstones. Probably a lot of you are too young to remember the Flintstones. Your loss, I assure you. Anyways, Fred Flintstone, this caveman, goes in a time machine. Maybe someone from the future came back with the time machine so that this caveman could get into the time machine and come into the present day. And he winds up at this, like a Stone Age theme park. Or it was like a theme park that had like caveman actors, actors pretending to be cavemen there. And so he goes to this like a hamburger stand, and he orders a hamburger or whatever it is and says, how much is that going to be? And then the clerk or the guy behind the counter sees him dressed like a caveman and says, that'll be 2 rocks. So Fred Flintstone just lays down 2 rocks because apparently that's what they used for money in the Stone Age. And the guy just starts yelling for the police. And I mean, it works in a cartoon, I guess, but it just doesn't work that way in reality. And when you read suttas where people are acting in a way that is just contrary to human nature, or like the whole I Dream of Jeannie show, one of my favorite shows when I was a kid. I had kind of a crush on Barbara Eden when I was a little kid. Here you got this beautiful blonde with superhuman powers who's madly in love with this guy. She's like bowing down to him and calling him master. And he's just like, get away from me. I mean, he wasn't gay either. I mean, it's like on TV and stuff, this works. But if you're reading a text that you think is potentially with an enlightened author, the founder of your spiritual system, and stuff is happening that just is like setting off alarms. It's like, this wouldn't happen in reality. Then immediately, you start having to put on the brakes with this. Theravada is like the original kind of Buddhism, that the Theravada Buddhists were afraid to change anything because things got changed. Of Theravada Buddhism Today, it's the most conservative school of Buddhism by far of all the schools of Buddhism that still exist. But just because it is the most conservative school of Buddhism by far, still it's not really super close to what the Buddha was originally teaching. So, getting back to the question of Terzaskas or whatever he's calling himself today, did I believe in most of the orthodox Theravada teachings? As a young monk, I didn't know most of the teachings. I mean, didn't know hardly anything about Buddha-Gosism or the commentarial tradition. So I kind of assumed that it was mostly true without knowing a lot of it. But then the more I learned and the more I read, the less I could adopt that position. So I'm just going to move on to Terzaskas or whatever he's calling himself today's second question, which is, when you have schizophrenia or take hallucinogens or just have extremely vivid dreams, you know that your brain or mind can generate everything, the whole reality with other people in it. How do you think Buddhism would explain people with multiple personalities? Because when there is no self, they of course cannot have two or three souls. Well, I mean, if there's no self, they cannot have one soul. So, I mean, how is a person with multiple personalities any harder to explain than a person with a single personality, considering that personality view is a wrong view in Buddhism? That even one person is one person too many. So, how Buddhism would explain, it would just be considered a kind of vipallasa, or like a derangement of mind. You know, it'd be kind of it'd just be considered to be like a kind of insanity or mental illness. And I mean, how would you explain multiple personalities when there's no self? I mean, that part of it is no harder than to explain why you would have one personality with no self. So that's a whole different kind of argument, that multiple personalities, you know, it's kind of incidental to the whole issue or doctrine of anatta or no self. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to Terzaskas or whatever his name is, his third question, which is, when you'll be a good sport and banish our endless questions by limit them to 2 for a person. I was considering if this one goes more than 3 hours, then I may limit it to 2 in future, although as it turns out, this one probably won't go for 2 hours unless I just keep yammering away about, you know, orange juice and that kind of thing. Just go off on multiple tangents. But so far, I think we're doing all right. And so the next question is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, you said a couple of videos back that you would like to take rebirth in Tawatimsa heaven if you were given the choice to speak your realm of rebirth, and Sudawasa, also known as the pure abodes for anagamis, weren't an option. So my question is, what do you think about some people who have the aspiration to be reborn in Tusita heaven to be able to meet Maitreya, or Meteya in Pali, and learn the Dhamma directly from him? Wouldn't you prefer to take that rebirth? I suppose, although I'm rather skeptical of the very existence of Tusita heaven. I think that the whole concept of Tusita heaven comes from an obscure reference at the beginning of a sutta towards the end of the Atthakavagga. And I can't remember which sutta that was. Maybe is it the Sariputta Sutta? I can't remember now. It's one of the last suttas of the Atthakavagga where it's like the Buddha came from a congregation of Tusita, and apparently Tusita got interpreted as a heaven realm that the Buddha was reborn from. That apparently it's like a tradition that, like, a Buddha in his life before his final human life, he spends it in Tusita heaven, which is one heaven realm above Tawatimsa. And Tusita just means sort of like the contented or the delighted. You know, it's a past participle of being happy, essentially. And so I think there is a possibility. I mean, you don't see Tusita heaven mentioned much in the texts. So, as I was mentioning, I think it was the previous Q&A, a lot of these 31 planes of existence, some of them, and there's practically no mention at all in the suttas, and the entire scheme of 31 planes of existence is never enumerated in the Pali Tipitaka. It's like a later commentarial artifact. And Tusita heaven, I'm kind of skeptical of a lot of these heaven realms and hell realms that I really have no persuasive evidence that would cause me to really think, yeah, that's likely to be legit. That it could just be mythology. It seems to me like it could just be mythology. So, if it exists, people want to be reborn there. Assuming that just being enlightened in this very life is not an option, they aspire to being reborn into Tusita heaven, which would be sort of almost like a Pure Land Buddhism kind of attitude, then I'm fine. I'm not like opposed to people who aspire to be reborn in this or that heaven realm. But Tusita really isn't described much. It's like you're gonna just sort of what's the word? Commit yourself to being reborn in this heaven realm that you know almost nothing about. Tawatimsa is pretty well described because that's where the main Vedic gods lived. And so that was sort of the heaven. It was like the heaven for the Vedic Brahmanists. And then the Buddhists just sort of accepted that and then just added a bunch of other heaven realms, above and, kind of one below it. So, yeah, I got no problem with people. Let's see. What do you think about some people who have the aspiration to be reborn into Tusita heaven to be able to meet Maitreya and learn the Dhamma directly? For me, it just smacks of mythology that is not necessarily based on empirical reality. But people can aspire to all sorts of things. And so long as they're not aspiring to just make my life a living hell, then, go for it. That's fine. I got no problem with that. So I'm just going to move on to Dhamma River's second question, which is, what's your opinion of angry abbots and teachers that verbally and physically abuse their students? And then he's got some commentary here. I have personally met people who were seriously traumatized by their teachers. As a result of this, they had stopped accepting teachers altogether, but they continued studying the Dhamma independently. I have also heard stories of people I didn't personally meet, but I heard of their stories nevertheless. Most of the time I saw this happening in Vajrayana Buddhism, but I also saw it happening in Theravada Buddhism in Thailand. I saw Theravada Ajahns hitting people, angrily scolding and abusing younger monks. I don't want to say their names because I don't want to bring disrepute to them. I don't want to ruin their reputation. They're quite famous, and you have even mentioned one of them here in previous Q&As. My mention to you is, how should lay people and newly ordained monks deal with an abbot or a teacher that is verbally or physically abusive? In my case, I would not accept it because if the Ajahns' mindfulness is so poor that he's incapable of controlling his own words and he's constantly breaking samavacha, or right speech, and his bodily actions are so out of control that he can actually hit others, then how could he possibly teach me or anyone else about mindfulness? He should lead by example. What are your thoughts? In your opinion, is verbally or just physically abusing your students ever justified? Well, this reminds me of a couple things. First, there's a saying in Zen Buddhism that when the Zen masters, it's like when the meditation hall is resounding with the Zen master's shouts and blows from his stick are falling like rain, still his mind abides in stillness. So a fierce teacher can still be very wise, potentially even enlightened. In Thailand, Ajahn Mun is considered to be, the archetype of the Arahant monk. He's the one they point to, him and Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Mun, and maybe Ajahn Mahabua. Ajahn Mun, he was fierce. He was scary. And in Burma, U Pandita was like this too. I mean, he just took an instant dislike to me. I mean, as soon as I showed up, practically, I was just kind of singled out as kind of being the whipping boy. And I mean, he would just get pissed off, not just at me, but in general, for some reason or another, on pretty much of a daily basis. And I have to admit that in U Pandita's case, regardless of how good of a teacher he was to others, I became rather skeptical. How wise can this person be, even though he obviously considers himself to be an Arya, like a Sakadagami? He kind of hinted at it, even though he wouldn't just come out and say it. Still, how wise can he be if he's getting pissed off every day? So, I think it can go either way. Some people, I mean, like I've mentioned recently, I mean, even the Zen masters who have the stick, they hardly ever hit anybody anymore, just because people have become so wimpy, so easily traumatized, that they might sue him just for smacking him with the stick. They answer the koan wrong. He goes whack on the head. They start crying to the police or something. So, I mean, if you come across a teacher who is abusive, then, I mean, it's your call. If you think that he's not a good teacher, then go elsewhere. Like Neem Karoli Baba up on the altar up there, I consider him to be possibly a fully enlightened being, but he was the same thing. He'd yell at people, he would hit people, but it was like Ram Dass got pissed off at him once because he was just storming and raging, just scaring people. That Neem Karoli Baba was doing this, and then it was like Ram Dass just kind of protested against him, kind of went on a strike against him, refused to go near him and this kind of thing. So Neem Karoli Baba called him, and it's like, no matter what you do with other people, never let them out of your heart. And it's like, if you're like a really advanced being and you're just a mirror of the other person's karma, there's like nobody there subjectively. You're just reflecting back their own karma. If they got karma to get abused, it's better off they get yelled at by someone who just like is just sort of full of love, really. I mean, that's all that's there, kind of. And that's one way of looking at it. It's just sort of tough love. It's like this fierceness that, I mean, some people may need that in order to get knocked out of their rut. They need to get beaten out of their rut. In Zen Buddhism, there's lots of that. Like, I think it's Umon, famous Zen master. I don't know his original Chinese name. He apparently had his enlightenment experience, or his awakening experience, his satori, or whatever you want to call it in Zen Buddhism, when his own teacher slammed Umon's leg in a door and broke his leg. At the moment of his leg breaking, as his teacher was slamming it in a door on purpose, he became enlightened. Or Rinzai, the founder of the Rinzai sect of Zen Buddhism in Japan. I don't think I've ever read a story about Rinzai when he wasn't hitting somebody. I've read several stories about Rinzai. Every single story, he's hitting somebody. And so some people that are like traumatized by their teachers, I mean, they're just kind of, I mean, it could be that they have this idea of what a teacher should be like, and so they're like severely disillusioned to a traumatizing degree. Or on the other hand, it may be that they're just brought into this kind of a degenerate culture where everybody is wimpy and flabby, and so even to get yelled at is going to traumatize them, in which case they're better off just not having a teacher, or using books as a teacher, or just going to one of those, the majority of teachers that talk in this soft, gentle voice, don't want to ruffle any feathers, because they don't want the trouble of people freaking out at them because they said something off color or maybe a little bit harsh. So let's see, what's the actual question here? There's like two question marks, one at the beginning and then one at the end. The first one, what's your opinion of angry abbots and teachers that verbally and physically abuse their students? It works for some people, it doesn't work for others. One size does not fit all. Just if it doesn't work for you, find a different teacher. That's what I would say. Although I think there should be a distinction made between a fierce teacher, which can be a very effective one, or the chronically pissed off, just, blatantly unenlightened teacher. And then suddenly I'm remembering the old story of the Way of the Sword, where this guy wants to be he wants to be a sword master. This is probably medieval Japan, like samurai Japan. He wants to be a sword master. So he goes to one of the most renowned sword masters, who is living as a hermit in the forest. And he says, teach me to be a sword master. And so the sword master looks at him and says, well, I could probably teach you in 20 years. And then so the student's like, no, I need to know fast. I mean, if I train really hard, if you just give me maximum teaching, then how long will it take? And then the teacher says, well, in that case, maybe 15 years. And then the students go, no, I need to learn fast. I mean, teach me just maximum, full blast. How long will it take? And he says, well, if you're going to go like that, it's going to take 30 years. So then the guy realizes, oh, okay, I get it. So the Zen master just has him just working in the kitchen. He's like sweeping floors and washing dishes and this kind of thing. No swords at all. And he's getting kind of fed up with this. He's starting to feel exploited, like he's just being used as free labor, when all of a sudden the Zen master, or the sword master, will just jump out from behind a corner and just beat him up and just leave him lying dazed on the floor. And this keeps happening until finally the student, he's got to be totally alert at all times, because he doesn't know when this maniacal sword master is going to jump out from behind like a doorway and just start wailing on him with a stick. So that was like the fastest, most intensive, best way for him to learn how to be a sword master, is just through just taking beatings on a regular basis. And I have to admit, people are different nowadays. We are living in a degenerate age. We are living in the midst of societal decadence. And so most people, they're just going to freak out. They're going to be traumatized. They're going to have to go to a therapist. It's like they're going to sue the sword master, all this kind of stuff. So you just have to know from your own personality if it's working or if it's not working. Even if your ears are ringing from being chewed out for the umpteenth time, like it happened with me at Pandita, where it would take like a day or two just to settle back down after one of these tirades directed against me. That, is it helping? You have to ask yourself, are you making progress? Even if you don't like it, even if it's very unpleasant. Taking a beating or being yelled at generally is not pleasant. But sometimes you may need that. But do you have like the fortitude to stand up to it and just not be traumatized by it? And then at the end, there's another question mark. What are your thoughts? In your opinion, is it verbally or physically abusing your students ever justified? Yeah, sometimes it's justified, although it wouldn't be abuse. It might be seen as abuse by others. But if it's genuinely like a wise teacher being fierce to his students, like Ajahn Mun or Neem Karoli Baba or Rinzai or whatever, then it's justified. If it works, it's justified. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And it occurs to me that spending 20 minutes on each question may result in a very long video. So next question is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, if you were alive for the early Buddhist councils and had to pick between the Theravada and Sarvastivada, who would you choose? Well, I have kind of thought about this. Like if I lived in ancient North India, when you had like the 30 schools, so-called, there's all these different schools of Buddhism, which would you choose? Realistically, you generally go with the one that has the local monastery. I think if I had the choice of all the early schools, I probably wouldn't choose Theravada or Sarvastivada. I might go with Sautrantika, which was one of the more conservative schools and didn't have an Abhidharma. But if I had to choose between Theravada and Sarvastivada, it would be a tough choice because both of them have good points and bad points. Sarvastivada had a more Einsteinian view of time rather than a more Newtonian view of time. In Theravada says only the present moment exists. The future is completely non-existent. The past is completely non-existent. There is only now. Whereas Sarvastivada believed past, present, and future all exist. It's just that we're only aware of this present moment that's constantly changing. Theravada believed that everything, excuse me, my nostrils are not cooperating, that everything is like flashing off and on a trillion times a second. Whereas in Sarvastivada, impermanence applies only to combinations of elements, that the individual elements, like a particle of earth element, is constant. It doesn't change. It's just that any combination of these primordial elements, these dhammas or dharmas, that those are impermanent. I think I might go with Theravada more on that one, although there's like complications, philosophical complications of the whole idea of everything flashing off and on. But with regard to karma, Sarvastivada it was almost like a Jain conception of karma, where karma was almost like a physical substance it was like this sticky substance that would adhere to your whatever. I don't know what it would adhere to. So I don't know, if I had to choose between Theravada and Sarvastivada in ancient times, like if I lived in ancient northwestern India or some such, I'd probably just go with the one that had the wisest teacher that I had access to, that was like local nearby. That, if I have access to the monasteries, I just choose which one had the better atmosphere, which one had the wisest teacher, and then just go with that one. Because, no matter which one you choose, there's always going to be a certain amount of like deadwood in the system. It's just going to be slightly different deadwood in the two systems of Theravada and Sarvastivada. So I'm just going to move on to the Xenothoid's second question. Excuse me, my nostrils are kind of, they got a mind of their own, you might say, now that I'm catching this cold. Okay, Xenothoid's second question. Where could one get their hands on a copy of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma and potentially other Sarvastivada literature? I know that I'm pretty sure there's English translation of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma, because they went with a kind of Sanskrit rather than Pali, so it's Abhidharma. And not a single book of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma is the same as the Theravada Abhidharma, even though they split apart at around the time of the Third Council, which is kind of indicative of how late Abhidharma made it onto the scene. You'd think that if the Abhidharma existed before the Third Council, when Theravada and Sarvastivada split, they'd at least have one book in common. But they don't. It was like, that's why they had the split, I guess. It was just sort of dueling Abhidhammas. The Sarvastivadins, favored this kind of philosophy. The Theravadins favored this kind. And so eventually there was like a schism that was formalized at the Third Council, according to my understanding of what was going on at that time. So, I don't know where you could find it. You're just going to have to search around on the internet. I'm sure that if you do some diligent searching, you can find the Sarvastivada Abhidharma somewhere. And if it isn't translated into English, it's going to be at least translated into French or German or something. And with regard to other Sarvastivada literature, the only Sarvastivada literature, like the original text that I ever read, is I read the Sarvastivada version of the Bhikkhu Patimokkha, the Bhikshu Pratimoksha. And also there's another, like a reform movement or a branch of Sarvastivada called the Mula Sarvastivada, which also had its own Vinaya and its own Pratimoksha. So I read the Sarvastivada version of the Patimokkha and the Mula Sarvastivada version of the Patimokkha. Mula Sarvastivada was more in the foothills of the Himalayas, like in North India, so that they had more Vinaya allowances for like how to live in cold weather. Like, I think it was the Mula Sarvastivada monks that when they went for alms, they had this stick, like a walking stick, that had these metal rings on the top that would jingle, and they'd hit the stick against the ground to let people know that they were there when they go for alms, because in the cold weather in this northerly region, they'd have their doors closed, unlike someplace like Burma, where people just leave their huts open. So there's as many flies inside as outside, so it doesn't really matter. And so there's rules, you're allowed to hit the stick like 3 times. And then if nobody opens the door, you're allowed to hit like 2 more times, and nobody opens the door, then maybe like 1 more time. And then if nobody opens the door, then you just move on to the next house, that kind of thing. So I can't remember the name of the book, but it was a comparative study of the Pratimoksha, and it had like several, at least 8 different versions of the Patimokkha. But where you'd find this stuff, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe Motilal Banarsidass publishes a lot of this kind of stuff. Just do a search on like Amazon, do a search for Sarvastivada on Amazon. You might come up with something. Just look around. I'm sure you can find something. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid also. And the Xenothoid says, I've heard you mention that there is technically one Sarvastivada temple left, but it has Mahayana influences. Where is it? And if you could, would you please post a Google Maps link of its location in the description? I think it's called Ritsu or Risu. It's called Ritsu or like something like Rishu in Japanese, which is the word for Vinaya. And there are a few temples near Nara in like southern Japan, which used to be the capital of Japan back in early medieval times when Buddhism was first being brought into Japan. When Buddhism first became more or less mainstream in Japan, Nara, spelled N-A-R-A, I don't know how to spell it with Japanese letters, sorry about that. It was the capital, and so there were a number of different kind of monasteries around the capital because it was like the cultural center of Japan at the time. And technically, this Ritsu school is at least based on Sarvastivada. It's a very corrupted form, it's like a derived form of Sarvastivada. And it has, over the centuries, absorbed a lot of Mahayana influence. But, if you look up, like, Ritsu, like R-I-T-S-U, or I can't remember the other version of the same name, that is what the school is called. It still exists in southern Japan, and there's still some temples around Nara. And that's the best I can do for now. And you can do the search based on that information as easily as I could, because that's the information I have on the subject. I was in Japan and was reading about Japanese Buddhism and was surprised to read that there still is technically Sarvastivada Buddhism in Japan around Nara, but it's very, very much influenced by Mahayana ideas and so forth at this point. And I might have to blow my nose. I'm really sorry about this. Just a minute. I should have planned ahead. And I've learned from reading the letters of Lord Chesterfield that in good company, when you blow your nose, you shouldn't look into the handkerchief afterwards, or the Kleenex in this case. That's gross. Don't do it if you're at a fancy dinner party. And don't get your dress sword between your legs when you're trying to walk, because that makes you look clumsy and ridiculous furthermore as well. Okay. I have to blow my nose much more carefully now that I have a mustache, for reasons we need not get into. So, let's see. Next question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam, occasionally still known as Libralam, and also occasionally known as Shrumo and Connor. So now we have the situation of a person whose name is longer than the questions that he asks. So we're going to have to abbreviate it in future, I guess. So anyway, Stellar Supreme, etc., says, what difference would you say there is between Mara enduring multiple world cycles and being a clever deceiver, and the Demiurge? So what's the difference between Mara and a Demiurge? Well, the Demiurge is not the absolute highest God with a capital G, but is just sort of the creator of this phenomenal samsara. So Mara doesn't create samsara. So that would be the main thing differing him from a Demiurge. A Demiurge creates the phenomenal world. Whereas Mara doesn't create it. He's living in the heaven realm of the gods who delight in the creations of others. That from the Buddhist point of view, it's ignorance, avidya, or like delusion, that is creating this phenomenal universe. And then Mara is just exploiting that. So that would be the main difference there. That Mara is not nearly powerful enough to create the phenomenal world. Brahma does not create the phenomenal world. Brahma's consort, Maya, in Hinduism, does not generate the phenomenal world in Buddhism. That Mara is just sort of exploiting for reasons of his own, trying to keep people from becoming enlightened. In a way, he considers himself to be like the king of samsara, but he's not the creator of it any more than a medieval king of France was the creator of France. Setting aside maybe like Charlemagne or something. We don't need to get into that. Or what was his name? Clovis? The first king of France? King of the Franks? I don't know. Let's just move on to the next question. Still from Stellar Supreme, et cetera, so forth, so on, ad infinitum. So, Stellar Supreme, et cetera, says Grok AI, which is Elon's version of AI generators, considers this to be the deepest question ever asked to it, within the reach that it pulls from including other AIs. I'd like you to take a crack at it. So the following question is what Grok says is the most profound question ever asked of it. And so the question is, if Nibbana is unconditioned, does quantum randomness, autopoiesis, hum it? And then, let's see, Stellar Supreme, et cetera, says, I reworded this slightly to make it a more charitable question. He called quantum randomness quantum seafoam. So apparently this profoundest question asked of Grok is, if Nibbana is unconditioned, does quantum randomness, does seafoam hum it? And I don't know what humming means as a transitive verb. How do you hum something? I mean, setting aside certain like erotic acts. I don't even understand the question. So it's not particularly profound to me because I don't know what hum means as a transitive verb referring to quantum randomness and unconditioned Nibbana. It just does not make sense to me. This isn't the first time that Stellar Supreme, et cetera, has asked me a question that, I mean, it's like not on the same level as the way my mind operates, so that I don't fully grok it, so to speak. I mean, I saw a picture of Stellar Supreme, et cetera, recently, and he looks completely human. But the way he thinks, I mean, he's like a gray human hybrid or something. So, I mean, if you can translate that into like standard English, but then it wouldn't be the same question that was asked of Grok, I suppose. If Nibbana is unconditioned, does quantum seafoam hum it? Oh, maybe. So let's try to work this out. Does quantum randomness like influence, like cause ripples on the surface of the unconditioned? Once it does that, it's not Nibbana anymore. I mean, it's two different levels of reality. So Nibbana is at the absolute level of reality, whereas like any kind of multiplicity or phenomena is happening in a different level of reality. You know, it's sort of like cup and ceramic, two different levels of reality, really. You've got essence of ceramic, form of cup. And I mean, in a way, it violates Aristotelian laws of thought because this is A and not A simultaneously, because ceramic and cup are not synonyms. Ceramic is not necessarily the same as cup. You know, you can have a plastic cup, you can have a glass cup, you can have ceramic ashtrays, but here we got ceramic and cup the same, and they're not the same, so it's A and not A at the same time. And that's kind of the way Nirvana and quantum randomness is. It's just two different levels of reality. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. After specifying that in the lame little analogy, Nirvana or Nibbana would be ceramic, it'd be essence, and the form would be like the quantum randomness would be appearing at the cup level. So I'm just going to move on to Austin here. And Austin says, a psychopath would take a life without experiencing negative volition, as they lack the emotional response that would typically generate such feelings. How then would karma affect someone with this condition? I've answered this question before. Maybe Austin didn't ask it, but I have been asked the question, if a sociopath feels like no conscience, you know, he can murder somebody with the same mental states as he would like cut a tomato in his kitchen, then how is he going to be getting any kind of like grave karma by doing that? And my answer, if my nostrils will cooperate, is that a psychopath isn't totally without karma, because a psychopath is, it's like there's still a level of empathy and compassion, but the psychopath is just like, he's like blocked off from his own subconscious mind. So the karma and all this stuff is happening at the subconscious level. We're not fully conscious of our karma. Most of us are oblivious to most of our karma. So the psychopath, it's not that he doesn't have this like this ethical phenomenon of karma going on. It's just that he is so locked up in like a relatively small area of his consciousness that there's like, what's the word? He's dissociated from deeper levels of his own mind. And these deeper levels are the ones that are creating karma. I mean, he can't be completely oblivious to the harm he is causing. Some sociopaths would like delight in the harm they are causing. Some are addicted to it. They get this rush, like this adrenaline rush, feelings of power or vengeance or whatever it is. You know, it's like somebody who is specifically targeting like homeless runaway girls who become prostitutes, for example. That, I mean, there's something going on at a subconscious level, even if he doesn't fully understand it. It's just that he is dissociated from deeper levels, which contain most of his wisdom. You know, it's like he's just cut off from this. He just dissociated from it, oblivious to it, but it's still there. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. Maybe I'll blow my nose again. Just a minute. Trying to get my nostrils to cooperate fully. Oh, I did it, didn't I? I looked into that was a faux pas. Probably the more cultured, sophisticated viewers are just going to like turn me off in disgust from now on. At least I haven't tripped over my sword. And I would like to point out, this is going to be a total digression before I get to thermal squid, that as a reflection on impermanence, you should all reflect on the idea that sooner or later, I'm going to run out of these paper umbrellas. So that's a sobering thought. Anyways, Thermal Squid says, feelings about philosophies of radical selfishness or individuality, especially the work of Max Stirner, who I've never read, or other kinds of individualistic and egoistic philosophies, such that a person is no longer captured by any ideas or views and actualizes their values without anxiety or worry about punishment or reputation. Well, I think the only philosopher that teaches radical selfishness or individuality that I'm familiar with would be like Ayn Rand. I assume Ayn Rand would qualify as a prophet of radical selfishness and individuality. Nietzsche to some degree, I suppose. Let's just go with Ayn Rand. What feelings about philosophies of radical selfishness or individuality? It says here, Thermal Squid says, such that a person is no longer captured by any ideas or views. Well, if you're not captured by any ideas or views, I mean, you're still going to have ideas and views. It's just that instead of following along with some external ideas and views, you're just going to create your own ideas and views, which are still going to be based on your cultural conditioning. You know, it's just going to be indirectly derived from other ideas and views. I mean, if you're just raised in isolation in a blank room your entire life, you're just going to be like a gibbering idiot. You're not going to have any ideas and views other than maybe like primitive animalistic ideas and views. I mean, if you even survive babyhood. So it's kind of an unrealistic idea that, I mean, such a person is no longer captured by any ideas or views. They're captured by their own ideas and views that they cook up on their own, but which are still culturally conditioned, just not so obviously as just adopting, you know, like progressive leftist views or conservative MAGA Republican views or whatever it is. They're, instead of just being a follower, they're going to come up with their own views, but still it's views and it's still going to be culturally conditioned, just indirectly so. They actualize their values without anxiety or worry about punishment or reputation. I mean, to some degree, that's getting back to the sociopath question, that you can actualize your values, but still you are an ethical being. You have like a grounding in, I mean, you make karma, which is sort of an ethical phenomenon. I mean, at least it can be viewed as an ethical phenomenon. It's more of an empirical phenomenon. I mean, once you get to the level where you can appreciate this kind of stuff, I'm sure there's a lot of skeptical atheistic types who would just call that bullshit. But then again, a lot of them would qualify as this same kind of person who, I mean, it's like they're dissociated from deeper levels of their own consciousness. They have less access to their subconscious than most people, which is one reason why they're so individualistic and just kind of disregard the ideas and beliefs of the people around them. You know, they're a little bit on the sociopathic side themselves in a lot of cases. So, I mean, if you don't worry about punishment or reputation, still, I mean, you can get punished and your reputation can take a nosedive. So, I mean, it might reduce anxiety at a certain level. Like a lot of sociopaths don't have a whole lot of anxiety. You know, it's like even like really good surgeons, some of them are sociopaths. I have read this, you know, it's just that they've got like this ruthless, just like ambition driven, goal oriented, kind of process oriented mind. They're really good at what they do. A lot of like high ranking, like business executives are the same kind of ruthless sociopathic type. Although in their case, like in the case of the surgeon, I mean, he's going to have to follow along with medical ideas to a large degree because medical science is going to come up with better ideas than he could come up with in isolation on his own. And that's the case with most people and most ideas. It's like, if you're not even going to be eclectic and borrow bits and pieces from the ideas that are already established, you're just going to insist on coming up with your own ideas. In all likelihood, your own ideas are going to be inferior to what other people have come up with, in some cases thousands of years ago, that have been tried and tested for thousands of years. So, let's see. Have I addressed this question sufficiently? Feelings about philosophies of radical selfishness or individuality. Well, I mean, selfishness and individuality are both delusional from the Buddhist point of view. So, I mean, there's that also. I mean, if a philosophy is based on radical selfishness or individuality, from a Buddhist point of view and from my point of view, it's based on delusion. So, I mean, if you've got a philosophy that's based on delusion and just glorifies this delusion, it's not going to end well. I mean, they might be successful in life, but still, I mean, it's not going to, they're probably going to be making more bad karma than good karma. Because, I mean, just for starters, everything they do is going to be motivated by a kind of gross delusion. Like, I'm doing this for me. And it's not going to end well. Even if they get rich and famous by doing it. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question. Are you appearing in my dreams intentionally? And as far as I know, I'm not. But then again, I don't remember most of my dreams. So it might be that I'm doing it and just not remembering it the next day. But I'm completely unaware of appearing in Thermal Squid's dreams or anybody else's dreams. My father actually experimented with this. He was really into ESP and that kind of thing, the occult, as he called it. And so he was doing experiments with like dream communications and showing up in people's dreams and so forth. And one time he wound up in the wrong bedroom and freaked out the wrong person because they actually saw like a visualization, like a full body apparition of my father in their bedroom. He wasn't there though, I promise. He was somewhere else. But yeah, as far as I know, I'm not appearing in anybody's dreams intentionally. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's third question. Feelings about epistemological nihilism and Pyrrhonism? Question mark. Well, epistemological nihilism is, it seems to me that epistemological nihilism would claim that you can't know anything for certain. But if that's the case, epistemological nihilism doesn't really have a leg to stand on because they cannot make that assertion. They cannot be sure that that assertion is correct. And this kind of leads into Pyrrhonism. The best thing I've read on Pyrrhonism, like the most authoritative text on Pyrrhonistic skepticism, is Sextus Empiricus, which I'm pretty sure is on the bookcase behind me. Sextus Empiricus, he was like a Roman philosopher who, I think he was a Pyrrhonistic skeptic, and it's like his books, or just book, is like the oldest like early text on the subject that still exists, that survived the Christian book burnings and all that. You know, the rooting out of paganism and pagan philosophical schools and all that. So, Sextus Empiricus did the same thing. I mean, he kept hammering away at the idea that you cannot know anything for sure. But if that's the case, how can you know that he's right? I mean, you can just offer it up as a hypothesis to live by, but you can't insist upon it because then you're claiming that there's still one thing you can know. And that reminds me of the Dighanaka Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, which I think is probably very ancient. And it's the sutta that caused Sariputta to become enlightened. Sariputta was standing behind the Buddha, fanning him, listening to the Buddha talking to this skeptical philosopher named Dighanaka, which means long fingernails. And when Sariputta was listening to the Buddha talking to Dighanaka, he became fully enlightened. So it's kind of an important sutta, and I think it's an old one, where Dighanaka comes to the Buddha and he says, nothing is acceptable to me. And apparently that's like no truth claim is acceptable to me. You know, it's like no idea is acceptable to me. And then the Buddha says, well, that idea that nothing is acceptable to you is still acceptable to you, isn't it? And it's like, you still have this one view that you're clinging to, and that's one view too many. And that's what caused Sariputta to become enlightened, I guess. So, yeah, I mean, if you really are kind of a Pyrrhonistic skeptic, it's best not to go around insisting upon Pyrrhonistic skepticism, because then you're still clinging to this assertion that you cannot prove. You've got this idea you cannot prove anything, that nothing is really knowable, and then you're going around insisting that nothing is really knowable, which implies that you know that nothing is really knowable, which is undermining your own position. You're contradicting yourself. But I do disagree with the whole idea that nothing is knowable. There is one thing that is knowable, and that is the absolute. That is ultimate reality. Anything else is just coherence theory of truth. It's delusion, ultimately, if you believe it. So, I guess I answered that one. Time to move on to the next question. This is from Wayne. And I think Wayne, let's see, 1, 2, 3. Okay, Wayne asked 3 questions. There's someone who asked the transgressive 4th question, and his name is going on a list too. So I got to separate these. I didn't separate them. It's all in one paragraph. And I have certain OCD tendencies with regard to questions. Sometimes I'll actually go in and like fix the spelling and grammar of a question just because it bugs me that it's not fixed. But I don't do it all the time, so I'm not clinically significant. So Wayne says, is enlightenment Nibbana? And Nibbana, there's like 2 kinds of Nibbana, or 2 ways of looking at Nibbana. You can look at it from the ethical side, in which case it is like the attainment of enlightenment. And then you can look at it from a more metaphysical side, in which case it's ultimate reality. Orthodox Theravada Buddhism would not say Nibbana is the only ultimate reality because of Abhidharma. According to Abhidharma, like nose sensitivity, like water element, like perception, all these things are ultimate realities. But I don't think so. I adopt more of a Mahayana, even a Majjhimaka point of view. That like Nibbana would be the only reality, but it's just off the scale. So you can't assert anything about it. You can't say it exists. You can't say it doesn't exist. You can't say that it does and doesn't exist. You can't say that it neither does nor does not exist. Any kind of claims is just invalid, because any claims you make are samsaric. That it's just completely at a different level of reality. Like ceramic and cup. You can't really describe the ceramic through any kind of like features of the cup, like shapes, like any kind of form the cup takes. You really can't say much about the underlying essence. So, is enlightenment Nibbana? Yeah, I mean, Nibbana literally means blowing out. It's like the blowing out of a flame. So the moment of enlightenment is like the moment of Nibbana in that case. But then that's just like as an ethical attainment, whereas there's also the metaphysical state, which is more of a Mahayana thing. Sometimes there's implications, like there's these suttas that have verses, where the sun doesn't shine, the moon doesn't glow, the stars don't sparkle, where earth, water, wind, and fire gain no foothold. They're talking about Nibbana there also, which is not so much of an ethical attainment. That seems to be like some kind of state. It's like an abiding state. But, I mean, it's all negative. It's like there's no this, there's no that, there's no the other. You can't really make any positive claims about it because they're all invalid. So, according to like one definition of Nibbana, like a word can have more than one meaning. And so Nibbana has at least two meanings that are related. One's just looking at it from a more ethical point of view, like a psychological point of view, and the other one is looking at it from a more metaphysical point of view. So I'll just move on to Wayne's second question. Or does enlightenment see Nibbana? No, I think I already answered that in the first one, because they're the same. And in a sense, the psychological state of enlightenment can see the metaphysical state of enlightenment. So I mean, there's that too, I guess. But I mean, talking about it is just a fool's errand. It's all futile. Futility of futilities. So I'm just going to move on to Wayne's third question. And is Nibbana right here, right now? Again, you can't make claims, but just let's say we're just going to talk metaphorically, poetically, Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. It's reality. Nirvana is reality, ultimate reality, not this phenomenal samsara stuff, but what underlies that. So it's right here, right now, and we're unaware of it, much in the same way that a fish is unaware that it is wet, even though it's just surrounded by water and suffused with water, still has no concept of wetness. It does not perceive wetness, unaware of wetness, even though it's wet all the goddamn time. So, yeah, I mean, we're in the midst of ultimate reality. How far away from here is ultimate reality? It's like the spirit of God to a theist. It just pervades the universe. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, do you think AI represents a deeper delusional plunge or doubling down into samsara? There is a godlike, Mara-like, if you will, aspect to the creation of realities from prompts or names. We've played the mind over matter game since language emerged. Example, having someone execute a task for us on the material plane by merely uttering certain sounds, which are the translations of purely mental phenomena called thoughts. But AI seems to be on a whole other level, or is it more of the same? So let's see here. Let's get up to the top. Do I think AI represents a deeper delusional plunge or doubling down into samsara? For some people, yes, but not necessarily for everybody. It's going to depend on the wisdom of the person. I mean, you can say the same thing with regard to just the internet. I mean, the internet was just sort of a revolution. In my opinion, the advent of the internet is the most important event that has occurred over the past at least 50 years. I mean, it's just revolutionized. That's one reason why things are happening the way they are politically. It's like people are able to see past the propaganda because they have access to guys sitting in their bedroom just ranting in front of a cheap camera who are getting more views than the people in suits with $1 million salaries sitting at these like cable news companies. So anyways, I'm sort of deviating. I'm rambling. Tangential thought, if you will. So do I think AI represents a deeper delusional plunge or a doubling down into samsara? I mean, potentially for some people it can be, but not necessarily. I mean, it doesn't matter how subtle and advanced things are. If you're detached from it, then you're fine. On the other hand, I mean, somebody could be living in a straw hut and they're just completely convinced that they are living in ultimate reality. That is just, this is it. You know, they're completely invested in this material, like animal existence. Then they're worse off than a wise person with some philosophical detachment coming up with all kinds of stuff on AI generators. So it's a matter of just how wise the person is who is exposed to this stuff more than the stuff itself. So it reminds me of a sutta in the text where the Buddha is saying that you've got one man who lives in a hut. He's got an ugly, foul-tempered wife. He eats bad food, sleeps on a hard, uncomfortable bed, but he's attached to it. So he's kind of messed up. On the other hand, you've got the guy living in a palace with the gorgeous wife, eating gourmet food. He's got all the stuff he needs, all the stuff he could possibly want, and he's got detachment from it. He's not clinging to it. Actually, the rich guy is better off than the poor guy in that case. Even though the rich guy, he's got more privilege and he's got more luxury and all this, still, I mean, the poor guy's living kind of an austere existence, which, I mean, is kind of a virtue, but he's sort of rebelling against it. I mean, it's just like he's not in harmony with the situation. So he's worse off than the rich guy. And it's kind of applies to this. It's like the person with no internet access who is just living in survival mode like an animal is still going to be worse off spiritually than the sophisticated person who, you know, he's exposed to Dhamma. He tries to live a dharmic life, who nevertheless plays on his computer sometimes and generates AI images and like has long conversations with Grok or whatever. Still, the second person is better off. It's a matter of how wise you are subjectively, not so much what is the external situation. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is also from Rui. Can the three characteristics be tinkered with? It seems to be a fairly ironclad triad governed by the logical principle of necessity. And for those of you who are innocent of Theravada Buddhist philosophy, the three characteristics, or the tilakkhana, are, let's see here, impermanence, dukkha, which would be like unhappiness, pain, suffering, dissatisfaction. Dukkha is hard to pin down with one English word. I usually use the word unease. So it's impermanence or inconstancy, unease, and finally no self, anatta. So sabbe sankhara anicca, all conditioned things are impermanent or inconstant. Sabbe sankhara dukkha, all conditioned things are unease, or conducive to unease at the very least. And finally, sabbe dhamma anatta, which is everything, whether it's conditioned or not, is not self. There is no self. No separated individuality that is ultimately real. So, can they be tinkered with? I assume, yeah, I'm sure people could tinker with them. but it does seem to be fairly good. I mean, you could probably, maybe I should have sat here and racked my brains for a while before doing this Q&A. I don't want to do it now because I'll just be like staring off into space silently, possibly for several minutes, possibly with like drool or something coming down. We're not gonna go there. So, I mean, you could probably come up with like a fourth characteristic that would also apply to everything, but the three characteristics are, you know, they're pretty solid, I have to admit. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quasitor. And Quasitor says, does samadhi mean to bring together or to focus on one object and disregard everything else? Well, literally, samadhi is the prefix sam, which it corresponds to like the Greek syn or the Latin con. So it means like together or with. And the adi, or the D especially, it means placement. So it's like placing together or like concentrating, you know, putting together. So that's maybe one reason why it's usually translated as concentration, because literally it means something like concentration. But still, samadhi, let's see, does it really mean to bring together or to focus on one object and disregard everything else? It can. And generally that's how it's interpreted in Theravada Buddhism. And it's sort of related to ekaggata, or one-pointedness. And that one may be more of a misunderstanding than samadhi. Like ekaggata, the mind that is one-pointed, is usually translated as one-pointed, but it's not necessarily one-pointed. It's sort of like unified. So long as your mind doesn't have a lot of moving parts, so long as it doesn't have any moving parts, you know, so long as it's just sort of a unified whole, then whether your focus is big or small, it's still one-pointed. Samadhi, I assume, could go the same way. I'm like, some samadhi is like formless meditation. So if your mind is completely empty, that's still samadhi. So it doesn't necessarily mean focusing your concentration on one point, but it does kind of mean that it's like your mind is simplified. And I mean, it's not even necessarily laser focused, because it can just be like wide open, so long as your mind is not diversifying. You know, it's sort of a relative lack of diversification would be samadhi. At least samadhi. Any kind of focus is going to involve a certain amount of samadhi. That samadhi is pretty much, you know, a dog has samadhi. You hold some treat in front of the dog, he's going to be focused on that treat. That's a kind of samadhi. It's not samadhi, it's not right concentration, but it is a kind of concentration. So Quasitor included a link to the Wikipedia article on samadhi, and I have to admit I didn't look at it. Didn't want to contaminate my point of view with external views, I guess. So samadhi literally means, like etymologically, it means like placement together or bringing together. More like placement together than bringing together, literally. And it can mean to focus on one object and disregard everything else, unless you get to the point where there is no everything else. You know, it's just all just this one object that is not diversified, if that makes any sense. But like a formless meditation, your mind is not concentrated down to a point because there's no form at all. You know, it's just this unified whole of infinite consciousness, infinite space, infinite nothingness, or the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Those are the four main formless concentrations according to Orthodox Theravada. That wouldn't mean that you're concentrating down to a point, even though that is like the highest form of concentration, or, you know, in the top level of, you know, most advanced concentration, or samadhi, I should say. So it's more like unifying the mind than like really necessarily concentrating it. Although for like a beginner, the way to unify your mind is just focus on one thing until you can get to the point where you can just look at the entire world and not diversify it. Then you'll have one thing just being everything. if that makes any sense. It's hard to explain. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, what's your favorite non-Theravada sutta and why? The only two that really come to mind, one would be the Heart Sutra and one would be the Diamond Cutter Sutra. The Heart Sutra, I don't think is necessarily in conflict with early Buddhism. So the Heart Sutra is, I mean, that could qualify as, like solid early Buddhism in a sense. The form is emptiness, the very emptiness is form. Now it's just sort of combining two levels of reality, because really the two levels of reality of ultimate truth and conventional truth, or whatever you want to call them, the thing in itself and the thing as it seems, that really, I mean, they're occupying the same space, so to speak. It's just that you see them in two different ways. So form is emptiness, the very emptiness is form. That is profound, and Theravada rejects this. Orthodox Theravada rejects it, but I don't think that the Buddha himself would reject it so unhesitatingly as like an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist Burmese scholar, Sayadaw Abhidharma master. And then again, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, that really inspired me more. I mean, it had more of an influence on my life than the Heart Sutra did. It was one of the things that sort of converted me to Buddhism to begin with, I think, was the Diamond Cutter Sutra. So, I mean, it would be a toss-up between the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Cutter Sutra. And my nose is plugging up again. Man, excuse me. I'll try really hard not to look into the Kleenex after I blow my nose, though. This time. Okay then. Okay. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to the next question after checking to make sure that there's nothing stuck in my mustache. PSA's second question. What are your thoughts on the meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky in the Oval Office that led to the deal not being signed? Yeah, I mean, today, at the time of me making this video, especially the first half of the day, most of the headlines apparently were about this meeting with Zelensky, with President Trump and Vice President Vance in the Oval Office of the White House. And Zelensky essentially got himself torn a new butthole. I mean, he just got dressed down. He was just sort of ganged up on, this sort of almost bullied, really. And one of my thoughts on that meeting, I think it's just a kind of tough guy diplomacy that Zelensky was kind of arrogant. He's insisting on more billions. We're not gonna have a ceasefire. We're just gonna keep fighting until the last US dollar is spent, the last Ukrainian man is dead. We're just gonna keep fighting. And Trump, being a kind of businessman, realizes that just pouring billions and billions of dollars into a black hole is not good sense economically, regardless of all the people dying. I mean, 1/4 of the population of Ukraine is now gone. They're either dead or fled as refugees. And Zelensky he was encouraged by the globalists. Just never back down. We're just going to keep backing you no matter what, because we're going to bleed Russia dry. And now there's a new sheriff in town, and Trump's just saying no to this bullshit. Where there's going to have to be peace somehow or another, even if Ukraine has to cede some of its territories. But, he was holding out this opportunity that by America getting certain land rights or mineral rights in Ukraine, that's going to mean an American presence in Ukraine, which would make Russia a heck of a lot less likely to start launching missiles into Ukraine. Plus, it's going to help pay for the billions and billions that are being sent to Ukraine, or that have already been sent to Ukraine. So Zelensky was kind of arrogant. He was encouraged to be arrogant by the globalists, including, former Obama appointees. And so he was cocky, I guess. He was just assuming that Trump is like an ordinary kind of politician, and he is not. And Trump, I mean, he's really playing hardball. And so it was sort of a diplomatic case of bad cop, worse cop, where they were just softening him up and letting him know that we're not playing your game. We're going to end this war somehow or another. And I mean, Zelensky, I mean, he's like an actor who is kind of installed. You know, he doesn't speak Ukrainian. I don't know. We don't need to go there. So my thoughts on the meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky, they were softening him up. They were preparing him for an agreement more advantageous to America. That's the long and the short of it, in my opinion. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U asks the transgressive fourth question, and his name is going on a list. So Yuga-U's first question. At least these are fairly simple questions. Yuga-U's first question. Can you please explain signs and features of objects within each 6 senses? Well, signs and features, I mean, anything that is perceptible. I mean, besides just the bare datum. You hear a sound, and it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. You know, you acknowledge that there is sound. I mean, you're aware of what the sound's like, but it's like you're not, like, singling it out and focusing on it and, like, interpreting it and attributing attributes to it. You know, it's just the sound goes in one ear and out the other. Sort of like a vision. You see something, it's like it's in front of a mirror. When it's there, and as soon as it's gone, it's not there anymore. You're not still like thinking about it afterwards. You're not saying, oh, this part I like and that part I don't like. And, you know, it's, or like flavors. You eat something, it's like, this needs salt. I mean, needing salt is not what you're tasting. That's just this attribute that you're attributing to this flavor. You're singling out, oh, the paprika's nice. No, it's just you taste what you're tasting. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the felt, there is only the felt. In the mentally cognized, there is only the mentally cognized. Thus should you train yourself. As the Buddha said to Bahia shortly before Bahia became enlightened and then was trampled by a cow. So, can I please explain signs and features? I mean, anything that is perceptual beyond just the first impression is signs and features. Regardless of whether you're seeing, hearing, tasting, thinking, feeling with your body, whatever, smelling. Almost forgot smelling. So, yeah, I mean, that's just the way it is. Anything that is not just, that does not immediately present itself, anything that is like an interpretation of that, just giving it a name, you know, just anything that you single out, any kind of commentary, any kind of perceptual interpretation counts as signs and features. Anything beyond the mere seen is signs and features. Anything beyond the mere heard is signs and features. So I think I'm just going to move on to Yugu's second question. Why is Nibbana called element in some sutras? It's referring to the metaphysical aspect of Nibbana as ultimate reality, as something that abides. And in Abhidharma philosophy, Nibbana is one of the 4 main ultimate realities, and it's permanent. It's one of the only elements that is permanent, that is like not subject to inconstancy and dukkha. It's still subject to not self, but it's not subject to the impermanence and suffering. So it's called an element. Nibbana dhatu is the Pali, which is just referring to Nibbana in the metaphysical sense and not like the ethical psychological sense, which I discussed a little earlier. So I'm just going to move on to Yugu's third question. Does consciousness stop when you realize Nibbana? No. I mean, you become more conscious. You wake up. That's what enlightenment is. Like the Buddha is someone who woke up. You don't stop being conscious when you wake up. You become more conscious when you wake up. And so I'll just move on to Yugu's fourth question, the transgressive one that has him out on a list. Who is exactly experiencing Nibbana? Nobody. I mean, there is no self. So it's, again, it's like reality just shines through. And the reality is more conscious than the person who is oblivious to reality. I mean, you can say there are a few old suttas that say that Nirvana is infinite formless consciousness. That's essentially what the Upanishads also say. The main difference is that the Buddhists, as a general rule, do not reify the absolute. You just don't even go there. Anything you say about it's going to be invalid. So who is experiencing Nibbana? Nobody. And I think even a materialist would agree with that, because they think Nibbana is just bullshit. So I guess I answered those questions, which I answered very briefly, partly because of the transgressive fourth question. And now I'm going to move on to kind of an interesting question. This is from Extremely Rare Bird. And Extremely Rare Bird says, how do you feel about the U.S. turning into an authoritarian regime like Russia? And I was unaware that it was doing that. So the U.S. turning into an authoritarian regime, Extremely Rare Bird apparently assumes that the Trump administration is sort of a quasi-dictatorship, apparently because Trump actually has a fucking spine. He's got balls. He's not like European world leaders or previous American world leaders that just go along with the status quo. To some degree, he probably would have done that if they hadn't tried to persecute him into oblivion for 4 years after rigging an election to make sure he didn't win. Trump is he's got more respect for the U.S. Constitution and for democracy than his opponents do. So I don't think the U.S. is turning into an authoritarian regime other than having a leader who is actually strong and decisive and is getting shit done within his limits according to the U.S. Constitution. Joe Biden was doing more unconstitutional stuff than Trump was, but you don't hear about that much if you're listening to like left-wing or globalist propaganda, which is what mainstream news actually is. Paid actors that are being paid to disseminate, to promulgate a kind of propagandist narrative. And that is collapsing largely due to the advent of the internet. So, how do I feel about the US turning into an authoritarian regime like Russia? Well, I'm glad we dodged that bullet by having Trump get elected president instead of having this globalist brave new world order taking over where everyone is essentially castrated. And Extremely Rare Bird also, this is not a question, but it's something that he included in the comments, and I might as well comment upon it. It says, Trump is a man of low moral character, someone taken over by greed and desire for power, doing whatever he can to get it through lies or force, clearly insensitive to violence and suffering. Evident lately by taking sides with Russia and blaming Ukraine for being invaded by them, apparently planning to take over Gaza and beginning to dismantle U.S. democracy. And there's some amazing statements in here. Like, let's see, clearly insensitive to violence and suffering, even though he's doing whatever he can to stop wars. Also, let's see here, beginning to dismantle U.S. democracy when the majority are on his side democratically. The Democratic Party is like consistently adopting the 20%. Like any position that it's like unlimited, like open borders. The majority of Americans don't want that. The majority of Americans want illegal aliens deported. The majority of Americans don't want trans women or biological males competing in female sports. It's like almost every position. The majority of Americans are in favor of like scrupulously auditing these corrupt bureaucracies that are just squandering tax money. That this is what the majority of Americans want. So saying that it's dismantling U.S. democracy is just fucking delusional. I mean, it was Biden who was going against the Constitution. It's the left that don't like the Constitution. They don't like the First Amendment. They don't like the Second Amendment. Or it's First and Second Amendments. They want to get rid of, like, what is it? The Senate. They want to change the Senate so it's representative. So they don't like that. They don't like the Electoral College. I mean, it's the left, the Democrats, who are more anti-Constitution. But some people, they just follow along with the propaganda. They don't look at the actual reality of what's going on. To say that Trump is a man of low moral character, they investigated this guy for a decade, trying to find any dirt they could against him. The best they can do is invent laws or just take hearsay evidence against him and use that, because they checked everything, like with the whole Russia collusion hoax. They were digging into anything they could find against him, and he was clean. So they had to just come up with shit in order to persecute the guy. They're trying to keep him, like, off the ballots. That's not democratic, is it? Trying to keep him off the ballots in, like, Colorado and a few other states. That's not democratic. Biden was doing all kinds of Tara Reid. You ever hear of Tara Reid? I mean, she said that she was raped by Biden, or at least sexually molested by him. There's actual evidence, more evidence, against Biden than was against Trump with regard to that E. Jean Carroll woman. They didn't care. They're just trying to destroy the man because they knew that he was going to dismantle this corrupt New World Order bullshit that was going on. And the majority of Americans support this. They support Trump. He won by the popular majority. So I don't know where Extremely Rare Bird is getting his news. From some echo chamber, apparently. But Trump definitely, I consider him to be the best president of the United States in my lifetime. I was born when Kennedy was president. So, I mean, look at Kennedy. I mean, he was a womanizer. He was having sex with teenage girls in the White House. It was kind of okay back then. It wasn't such a big deal. Joe Biden. I mean, he was peddling influence. I mean, he was corrupt as hell. Nobody cares. I mean, he wasn't running the country anyway. He was so senile that his handlers were running the country, who were, like, all fully invested in, like, the Obama vision of the Brave New World Order. So don't give me any of this bullshit about Trump as a man of low moral character. Look how his children have turned out. Compare that with Biden's children. At least Hunter. Plus the daughter that he was apparently taking showers with when she was teenaged. So it's just ridiculous. And so I'm just going to go on to the very last question. Last question. This is from Pokyag Tomek, who presumably is from the planet Gorvesh Alpha 7, because that doesn't strike me as any kind of human name. At least I've never come across the name of Pokyag Tomek before. I mean, it really does sound like it's from a science fiction movie. I hope I didn't offend Pokyag Tomek. It's like, I consider aliens to be at least as good as we are. So there is that. So anyways, this person says, "It is March already. Where is your new book?" And I mean, it's only the beginning of March. It's March 1st at the time of me doing this video. So yeah, it's not finished yet. I still have to finish writing the introduction. Like, all the chapters are done. My sweetie still has to illustrate a few things. She's got to do the cover and a few, like, line illustrations. And that's about it. So it's almost done, but it's not done yet. So I'm still hopeful that it'll be done by the end of March, which is, I said sometime in March, maybe. So I'm not exactly behind schedule yet. I haven't missed the deadline yet, but it's in the works. The new book is in the works, and it's going to be more like memoirs, like personal memoirs, less philosophical. There's going to be some Buddhist philosophy and, you know, what it's like being a monk, living in Burma, living in Asia in general, living in America, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's close to being done, but not completely done yet. And I do hope that it'll be done by the end of March. And that's it. That's the last question. So this is a relatively short one, less than 2 hours, which is good. If I hadn't been like digressing and ranting, it could have been way less than an hour and a half, which would be phenomenal. So like I always should say at the beginning and almost never do, if you have any questions about things that you think I can answer, like especially early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Burma, Buddhism in general, Eastern philosophy in more general, philosophy in even more general, meditation, monasticism, me personally, this kind of stuff, I'm pretty reliable with regard to answering something with some intelligence to it. But just naming somebody, what's your idea of Martin Miller? What do you think about Martin Miller? And chances are I've never heard of the guy. I don't know who Martin Miller is. I wouldn't recognize him if I saw him in the street. So I guess that's it. Just hit the like button or smash it if you prefer, and subscribe if you haven't already. I assume if you got this far that there's something of interest to you. And aside from that, I just say be happy. So be happy.